I presume you're here for the same reason I'm here, and that is to talk about aquatic exercise equipment. And to be clear, we're talking about not flotation equipment. I did bring one here. We're not talking about flotation belts. That's another whole workshop. We're not talking about anything that's holding you up in deep water. This is a wave rider, which is a very cool way to float in deep water. We are talking instead about things you might either attach to your limbs, or you might hold on to them. You might attach them to arms or legs, or hold on to them, or have something on your feet. In fact, even wearing shoes when you're in the water. How many of you have done an aqua fitness class wearing shoes? Yeah, and you notice that even though the shoe may not be one of these special ones that's designed, there used to be one from Aqua Jogger, I think, that had little fins on it. So it was designed to actually pull more water because it had these little fins, like fish fins down the side. I don't know if they still make them, but even just any shoe is going to give you more resistance, and we'll talk about why in a moment. Okay, now let me see if I can get this moving for you. Are you talking to each other here, guys? Okay, so we're going to explore the following, and you do have the handout, but you know, if you didn't get it for some reason, or you can't open yours or something, let me know before we're done tonight, and I'll make sure you get another copy of it. So we're looking at aquatic overload. We're looking at the purpose or need for aquatic strength training, essentially, equipment. And we want to think about safe usage, because that was your question. I think is it Blanche? Blanche DX? Yeah. Say again?
It's Blanchard, Blanchard. Denise.
Blanchard.
It's Denise.
Denise, right. Yeah. So I didn't think I had a Blanche on my list, but you know, people like to call themselves different things in workshops. So anyway, so we're also going to look at safe usage. That's very important to me that we think about that, and how it might affect your class design, or how it might affect the way you want to overload in a class compared to not using equipment. So we'll look at a variety of equipment. I'm surrounded by stuff here. So I'll have a bunch of things to hold up and look at that create resistance or intensity overload in different ways. So we're looking at buoyant equipment. We're looking at resistive equipment. So resistive, there's an example of that. It is a wand. You've probably all seen these, and you can dial it so it is less water flow through or more water flow through. And then of course we have our classic dumbbell. So we'll look at whether we're looking at buoyancy as part of the overload that we're creating, or maybe even elastic resistance. So I brought some elastics along today, and we'll talk about that as well. We want to consider best practices. So if you are going to add equipment to your class, why are you doing it? And what is right for the group that you're working with? So I think you really need to think about that. If I have a group of people mostly 80, 90 years old, well, if they're super fit, sure. But if they're not, or if they have a lot of arthritis in their hands, maybe I won't want them hanging on to dumbbells. Maybe I'll find something different. And I'll show you some options today that might be like less expensive, and also safer for and better for some applications if you're dealing with populations that are not super fit. Put your hand up. How many of you are dealing with people who are very fit? You're working with teams, maybe. You're working with some young folks who are quite strong. Okay, so that's great. So we have a mixture. If you didn't have your hand up, I presume you're not working with those populations. So why do we want to use equipment? Let's think about that. So the main thing is we're looking at overload. Okay, why are you doing anything with related to exercise? You're overloading. So you're trying to do more than you're used to doing. And the miraculous human body responds by getting stronger. We kind of beat it down a little bit by giving it more than it's used to doing. And in response, your wonderful body will rebuild, refresh, stronger than it was before. Unless you create an injury, and then that's another whole kettle of fish. The short forms here that you're going to see, MSE stands for muscle strength and endurance. CVX stands for cardiovascular exercise. So when we are looking at overload, we're kind of looking at a combination of those. Typically in the water, it's much harder to tease them out in a water exercise session than it is when we exercise on land. A misconception is many instructors and a lot of participants think if you don't put a dumbbell in my hand, if you don't put a wand in my hand, if you don't give me something extra, I can't possibly work hard enough to generate overload. They're wrong. They're just flat out wrong. They just don't yet know how to work in a way that will overload them to fatigue. So having done this kind of stuff for a very long time, probably the fittest group I ever had the joy to work with briefly was the Puerto Rican men's volleyball team. Now that was only for an afternoon, darn it, but those guys were very fit. And they came to the water just to lounge around and relax. They were lazy. It was so hard to get them going. But, so there, and I know some of you are working with fitter groups, with younger groups who have pretty high goals when it comes to improving their fitness levels. So another reason for adding equipment as well, of course, is just to add variety. If people are coming to classes several times a week, they just want something different, or they want to overload differently. And different pieces of equipment cause our muscles to engage and work differently. They cause our stabilizers to work differently. So, there's a case to be made for variety. Why do we use equipment? Well, often because it's there. Because we've always done it this way. Equipment was purchased. It's sitting in the equipment room. So you may have your participants or your management say to you, Paulette, how come you don't have the equipment out there? I spent $8,000 on equipment for our classes and you're not using them. What's wrong with you? So often there's pressure to use equipment, even if you might think, it's my Tuesday evening group, okay, but my Wednesday morning class, I don't think it's the right thing for them. So you may be in the circumstance where you have to kind of screen it out a little bit and decide who might be okay to use equipment and who might not. So you can feel pressured. Participants, I know instructors who've gone to facilities with our AQX leadership course. We teach instructors to be able to create overload without the use of extra equipment, knowing that if you want to do that kind of thing, that's another training piece. And you should be able to do the basics first really well before we add that training piece, that extra overload that you can get with all the different kinds of equipment or the different kind of overload. So I know of instructors who've rolled up into a facility or they're subbing for somebody and everybody just goes and gets their dumbbells out of the equipment room. They don't ask, they don't assume that the instructor will facilitate that. They just go and get it because they're used to it and that's what they plan to do. And you have a very hard time talking them out of doing it. So muscular strength and endurance strategies. Overload means doing more than you're used to doing. And if you split out endurance and strength, this is all review, I'm sure, for everybody, but just to think about what does endurance mean? Endurance means something that I can do for more than 10 or 15 reps. I might be able to do 20 reps. I might be able to do 30 reps with pretty good form. So it's a very submaximal load that I can do for quite a period of time. So something like a ski in deep water, done really well with good technique, that's building endurance in all the hip flexors, hip extensors, core stabilizers, shoulder flexors and extensors. And it's endurance. If I can keep it up for a minute at a time, 2 minutes at a time at a fairly nice intensity, then that's working on endurance. I'm also working on my cardiovascular system because my cardiovascular system is supporting all those muscle groups that are keeping me going in that deep water ski for however long I do that interval before I change exercises. Strength is something where you think about fatiguing. You might say 10, you might say 12. It depends on the research you're looking at. But let's say around 10 or 12 reps is the maximum I can do. For really high strength, you may only be able to do 2 or 3 repetitions. And you either have to change the exercise or you have to stop. And what happens is people, they change the exercise. They end up just not doing it with any kind of technique. They make the range much smaller. They will put their arm in a different alignment so they don't use the flat surface of their hand. So without equipment, we're looking at overload using surface area factors. So that is the shape of your hand meeting the water. That's surface area. Okay, the length of my limb meeting the water in the direction of movement. The way I angle my feet sometimes can also affect the surface area that's hitting the water in the direction of movement. SOM is speed of motion. So yes, resistance increases exponentially with speed. So you might say, well, all I have to do is to get people to go incredibly fast, and they will be as overloaded as they can be. Well, what happens when you do that? You get them to go incredibly fast, and all of a sudden their range of motion becomes tiny. They end up doing these tiny little pulsing kinds of movements. I'm not a fan of those movements, pulsing. They used to do that in fitness classes back in the 80s. Anybody remember those? And you'd hold your arms out to the side, and you'd hold the weight, and you'd pulse your arms up and down until the tears ran down your cheeks. And they're thinking, oh, you're getting so fit, you're getting so strong, you're keeping those weights moving. Good for you. And I'm thinking, all right, so now I've left with my shoulders really sore, my neck super tight. All of that activity, is it functional? Not unless I do this for a living. If I do this for a living, okay, maybe that's a function. Maybe I'm a window washer and I stand between two windows and that's what I do. But I think that, the chicken dance, something like that. But I think in most cases, it would be better for me to work through a more functional range, or maybe pick out some shoulder muscles that need attention, like external rotator cuff, instead of just beating up my deltoids and my upper traps because they're holding me up like this to keep going. And anytime you're holding a muscle really tightly like that and doing that pulsing activity, it's really not conducive to good blood flow, to good breathing, or to good blood pressure. We can talk more about those if you have questions about those later, but that's kind of that in a nutshell without equipment. I want good range. I want to optimize the surface area factors that I'm using. I'll optimize speed of motion to allow me to get the biggest possible range I can while working through that range. And doing that, most people can overload very effectively without adding equipment, using big range of motion. So here's an example. I might be going at, let's say, half tempo. We'll go back to our deep water ski. I'm half tempo, deep water ski. I'm doing ski arms. I'm trying to do a nice big range of motion. I'm trying to go surface to surface with my arm. I'm trying to get equal action behind my hip and in front of my hip. And let's say I'm doing it at half tempo. If I, as the instructor, then tell you, all right, now I want you to move at tempo, not half tempo, but with the same range of motion, it will be incredibly hard. It will be a very intense interval of work, as long as they actually don't cheat the range, as long as they keep the range really big. And that's why you're there as the coach, to watch them and say, hey, the range is dropping. We're going to try to do this interval with the full big range. If we can, do the biggest range you can, but you're now trying to do it at tempo. When you feel you can't control the movement properly, or you're really shrinking in the range, you could go back to half tempo and lengthen out your range again. It's really remarkable, and I'd like you to get in the water and try that. Get in the water and really have a look and see. If I take something like a march or a ski or a jack, and I do it really large, my nice big range at, let's say, half tempo, and then I make a note of what is my range, and I speed it up to tempo. I double the speed, but I keep the range the same. You've just quadrupled the workload by doing that, and you'll see more about that in a second. Save up your questions if you have some, and we'll come back to them. Adding equipment. If people cannot overload without equipment, if they're moving super well, they've got big range, they're using the surface area factors, right? They're using that higher speed of motion and maintaining the range of motion with the surface area factors. They're doing that, and they're saying, you know what, coach, I'm just not tired enough. I don't feel like I'm fatiguing myself. Then I would say to them, well, let's talk about gloves. That would be my first thing to go to. And we'll spend more time on that a little bit later. All right, so this is my darling husband. I want you to watch him move. He's got a set of essentially this in his hands. He has a set of ankle cuffs on. They're buoyant. And what would you say about his movement? You can unmute yourself if you want to make a comment. Anything you notice about his movement? How's his posture?
Not straight.
Yeah,
Not straight, right, Denise? Yeah. What else are you noticing?
He's too crunched over. He should be a nice straight back.
Yeah, you want a nice
His
long
range,
torso.
his range is very short.
Very short.
Very
range,
small, both the hips and the shoulders. I'll let you see it again. So he's got me in the pool with him to help coach him, but we've been married almost 50 years. So how do you think that goes? Not so well.
Not
So
listening.
he was actually quite surprised when I showed him. I just took it when he wasn't paying attention. And I just got off to the side and I captured that little moment. And I showed it to him later and he said, "Oh, you've done something to that. I'm not sure what he accused me of, but it was like that wasn't him. And somehow I'd photoshopped it to look like that. That's what you actually look like. And when I'm asking you to stand up a little straighter and try to get your arm past your shoulder and your leg past your hip, that's what I'm talking about. But people can't see themselves move. We don't have mirrors in the pool. Can you imagine the cleaning job that would make? We don't have a reflection to see. In the gym, we can see how we're lined up and whether or not we're doing what the trainer asks us to do or what we intended to do. In the pool, we just cannot see that. We know that overload can target intensity, which is strength, so lower reps, higher load. And we can target duration, which is endurance. So that's going to be more reps with a lower load. So overload can be either of those things. And of course, it can be cardiovascular as well. But we're talking about strength here. So people need to learn to move well to create intensity. If people are moving that poorly without equipment, and by the way, he does move that poorly without equipment, why would you hand them a loaded gun? I want to see them moving really well with a big range and getting pretty tired, not using equipment. And you really can't do that pretty tired without equipment unless you are well lined up and you're using a big range. Many people need encouragement to keep good quality of movement for long enough to create the overload that they want for muscular endurance and strength. An important part about the water is that we create our workload by how we stabilize and how we move. And I'm always refreshing people's memory about that. You create your workload. It's not like when you go to the gym and you get on a piece of equipment, the weight is set at a certain amount, the cable is where it is, you're all lined up and ready to go, and you know that you're moving 125 pounds or 50 pounds or 75 pounds, and you're doing it through the range of the equipment allows for the number of reps that you want to do. The water's a whole other game. It's a different planet. So people need to learn how to stabilize their core really well so they can move their limbs vigorously, powerfully. And that's how they create their workload. Participant education is just so important because that is where we can really get people to grasp the idea that their workload comes from them. It's not from me jumping around on the deck like a maniac. It's not from throwing a bunch of equipment into the pool. It's how they hold their body in place, how they stabilize their core, and how powerfully they move their arms and legs, how vigorously, how big the range is. You generate your workload by selecting and maintaining larger surface area of your moving hands, longer limbs, largest possible range of motion at an optimal speed, so that the speed is the place where people can really fine tune. If you've got some super fit people in your group, you get them going full range and tempo speed, they're going to work very, very hard. They might be surprised how hard they're working. What happens when they get tired? You're asking them for that and they're doing it. So what happens when they start to get tired? Let's say you're giving them 2 or 3 minutes of skiing, maybe changing the arms up a bit here and there, or traveling, doing something pretty tough. Let's say you're doing a propulsive ski across deep water. What happens when they get tired? What do they do? Anybody have an idea? Have you seen it? What do you see them do, Anne?
Their shoulders start slumping, the range of motion gets much smaller, they start huffing and puffing and they slow down.
Yeah. So, because they're not keeping up, that is telling you and it's telling them that the workload you're giving them is enough to overload them. If they're not noticing that they're kind of cheating the movement, cheating is kind of a negative word, they're just not keeping up with what they intended to do and what you coached them to do. They're not able to do it. They are sufficiently overloaded without adding anything else. If they can't really keep up with that, do they need more? It just means they'll get tired quicker and move more poorly, more quickly. Your workload depends on how you stabilize, how vigorously you move, movement quality and intensity. You have to have a stable core. So it means that everything you're doing with your arms and legs is challenging core stability. Everything you're doing is a core workout. When you're stabilizing the core and moving really powerfully with your arms and legs, Every single thing you do from warm up to stretch is core work. And there's another thing people have to learn because they often don't get it. They think they've got to crunch or tuck or do something else to nail the core down. Well, the core is working functionally and beautifully as long as they're staying well aligned and really rocking it with their arms and legs. People who can move well, yet still aren't feeling enough overload, they're the ones who probably will benefit with equipment. And I'm not really talking about rehabilitation here. That's another whole kettle of fish. Because with rehabilitation, we're moving at much slower speeds. We might be doing things like maybe supporting somebody with one of these little rings on an arm or a leg to help assist the buoyancy of their arms so they can gently go through ranges. So use of equipment in therapy is quite different. We may be creating overload with it, but we might also be creating support or some other dynamic that we need specifically for the rehabilitation goals. It's really so important that we're coaching well. We're coaching people to move well because they can't see themselves. When they start to fatigue in the water, as I mentioned, usually their technique suffers. I'm sure you've all seen this. I call it cheating the movement, and I don't call them cheats, and I don't use that word in the class. I'm using it with you because, you all understand this. You see people, they were doing a flat hand with their palm forward, full range, and now it's turned into a slice once it gets past their hip. So they don't even know they're doing it. It's their body finding that little way around whatever the activity is to make it a little easier for them. So when they do this, when their range of motion drops, when their speed drops, when their limb length shortens, when their hand shape is no longer a flat surface in the direction of movement, the workload drops. If we want intensity to be maintained, we have to have the mental focus. We have to keep a very strong mental focus about that powerful core and about the limb movements being what we intend them to be. So nice big range, long levers, flat hand, whatever they are able to do and want to do. Those are the things they're trying to do. Their endurance and their strength will be tested by those things and how well they keep up with those things. Calculating aquatic workload. I am a scientist. I am not a mathematician, but this is from a university physics resources about calculating pressure drag. So you can calculate pressure drag, which is the resistance we feel in the water. You can calculate it moving through any substance. So you can say, well, what's the workload of walking through a vat of honey? That could be calculated, and that you'd be calculating the pressure drag of honey. We instead are in pool water. Here are the elements that go into that calculation. I don't want you to be doing math problems while you're trying to get to sleep tonight, but I do want you to know that these are the variables that are involved and what variables we have control over. And to me, that kind of just shines a light on what I want to do and what I want to help people understand. So coefficient of drag, that is a measure that's calculated in a laboratory. So it looks at kind of the size and shape, but more about the shape of the object and whether the object is turbulent or streamlined. So the coefficient of drag would be very different for this little ankle or wrist cuff than it would be for holding on to this. So coefficient of drag is something that's calculated all the time for things like car body designs to see how streamlined they are, for boat hulls, for golf balls, for other things that are going through a medium which might be air or it might be going through water. And we want to see a coefficient of drag that is something that really creates a lot of turbulence around it as it tries to move, has a higher coefficient of drag. And that's a number, it has no units, it's calculated in a lab. So there you go. That means you can't calculate your workload unless you work at a lab. But at least you know what that is and where it comes from. Density of water is 1. So there's coefficient of drag, an experimentally determined number. Density of water is 1,000 kilograms per cubic meter. Air is 1 kilogram per cubic meter. So water is 1,000 times more dense than air. And you may have it popping up in your head as I would. Is seawater different than pool water? Yes, but probably not enough for us to discern the difference. The main thing in seawater, I think, is that you're going to feel more buoyant. So controlling your core with that buoyancy may be more of a challenge than the difference in density of the medium. Speed of motion is the next thing. And resistance increases exponentially with speed. So if I double the speed, it's 4 times the resistance. If I triple it, it's 9 times the resistance. Quadruple it, 16 times the resistance. That's the only math I'm going to do tonight. So if you put the speed up, the resistance goes up exponentially. It's not a straight line relationship. Frontal area, and that's the size of the surface area moving against the water. So if my hand is what I'm looking at for frontal area, and I'm moving straight forward and back through the water, and I'm doing it with a slicing hand this way, I have a different amount of resistance than if I have a flat hand this way or a flat hand this way, pushing through the water. That's a different surface area, even though it's the same body part. I'm just holding it so that I meet the water with my limb differently. So calculating aquatic workload, there's your equation again. The only density of water is a given, and coefficient of drag, we don't know it. We can guess that it's going to be higher for one thing than another, but it would have to be tested. We know we really have a lot of control over speed of motion and frontal area. So coefficient of drag, we're going to control by looking at the kind of equipment, if we add equipment, and whether it creates a more turbulent flow. Otherwise, we're really thinking about speed of motion and frontal area. So I've already told you about the coefficient of drag, and you have that in your handout. And so if something's very streamlined, that's going to be easier to move through the water than something that is very turbulent in nature, that is designed to create eddies and currents and turbulence as it moves. Resistance, there's your equation again. There's density, there's speed. Here's the little resistance visual. I kind of like this little visual. As the speed goes up in this little graph, resistance increases exponentially. Honestly, if I took those really, really fit, buff Puerto Rican volleyball players and I could get them to move full range, I could reach a speed where they couldn't do it without equipment by speeding up. But if I'm going to speed up, I got to keep the range. Otherwise, I drop the workload. Frontal area, surface area meeting the water in the direction of movement. So think about frontal area when we start looking at different pieces of equipment, and look at how the size of something is going to be part of what creates that workload. So here we have our little buff chick again. There's our equation again. Are we streamlined? Exponential increase, surface area in the direction of movement. Now think about that. So I will have people maybe use a flat hand where I'll hold it this way, but it would be down by my hip. I'm doing a flat hand palm forward on my ski arm, but when I get past my hip, I change my hand, so it's actually slicing. So frontal area has changed, even though I didn't intend it to, and I might not even be realizing that I'm doing that. So that's why maybe I'm not getting the workload I intended. We're going to look at other factors besides what's in that equation when we start thinking about equipment. Basic physics, grade 8 or whatever, you learned that work is force times distance. So in this case, range of motion is the distance. Pressure drag, that coefficient of drag times density times speed times frontal area, that's resistance. So pressure drag or aquatic resistance is the R, and range of motion is how far you move. When we start adding equipment, we got to think about buoyant forces. What's happening with buoyancy? Lynn did this little experiment. We talked about it because she was doing an equipment workshop and said, you know what? How much weight is this in terms of buoyant forces? What am I looking at? And you can tell by looking at it, we're also looking at surface area, aren't we? So it isn't just a buoyant force. It's a surface area, it's a buoyant force, and we also don't know how turbulent this is. This looks pretty smooth, like it would run through things pretty well. Let me grab you another toy. How about this one? Okay, so this one is buoyancy neutral. I don't have a buoyant effect, but I've sure as heck got a turbulent effect with those little clobber hobs on the end. So this is streamlined, this is not. This doesn't have a buoyancy component. This does. It starts to get to the point where your head spins around like Linda Blair in The Exorcist, because trying to calculate or even estimate what you're doing in terms of load is really tricky. So I know that Lynn tied a bunch of ingots, tied a bunch of hand weights to dumbbells that were at her facility and was looking at how much load it actually took to just submerge some of those dumbbells, some of those aquatic, the floaty dumbbells. And she was getting what, 5 pounds on some? Feel free to unmute, Lynn, if you want to tell us about it. This is 8 pounds on this one, and that's a pretty standard size dumbbell. Lynn,
Yeah,
do you have anything to say?
The idea here was this one was 8 pounds of force. When I added 9 pounds, it sank, but at 8, it did not.
Right. So it takes at least 9 pounds of force to get it under the water.
Yeah.
Right. We're also dealing with increasing the surface area of our limb, and we don't really know what the coefficient of drag of this is. The point being, what the heck are you doing with workload? You don't know. It's really, really hard to calculate. And in fact, a lot of scientists don't want to even go toward doing research on water-based exercise. Instead of looking at things like those numbers that are what might be up in that equation, they'll look at the effect of the tool. So they'll measure my heart rate, they'll measure my VO2, they'll measure my blood lactate, they'll look at the parameters that tell the world how hard I'm working and how close I am to my maximum. Because it's just about flipping impossible to measure the amount of work I'm doing by looking at the equipment. Not like a gym where I can say, well, I moved 125 pounds 8 times. I don't know how much I move. And you know very well, if your buoyant equipment gets old, the buoyancy characteristics change, don't they? They get waterlogged, they get soggy. So you may have thought you had an idea that this was about 9 pounds to submerge it, and maybe now it isn't, because it's partially waterlogged, and maybe a kid took a bite out of it. So that changed the turbulence of the shape, and it changed the amount of buoyant mass that you're moving. Are you confused yet? It's so tricky to calculate. I hope, if nothing else, you walk away from today thinking, wow, there's a lot to think about. When I start adding pieces of equipment to what people are doing, it's not straightforward. It's not simple. It's not one size fits all. We know that our participants are very different in terms of their physical characteristics, what they can and can't do, what's going on with their body, what their health history is. They're very, very different. 2 dumbbells they pick up can be entirely different for all the reasons I just mentioned. Consider looking at buoyant, elastic, and weighted equipment. And so that's your next slide here. We have up on the top here, your typical examples of buoyant equipment. Your classic noodles, all kinds of shapes, sizes, different lengths, little noodle pieces. Got another length here. I have even cut them up so that people just have essentially a disc. So it's only maybe a couple centimeters wide, just a little disc that you can hold in your hand, like a little flat plate. And for some people, they like that because it kind of supports their hand. So that's buoyant. You may also opt for something like your little dollar store balls that are buoyant. And that, of course, is going to be streamlined. It's also going to support my fingers and thumb without having to grip awkwardly if I wanted to use something that's just a little something for variety, to give people a little something different to do. Look at the kinds of equipment you have here. Elastics come in all shapes, sizes, and densities. They don't have a good shelf life in the pool. They have some really good rehab applications because they create eccentric loading. They don't tend to last very well. Again, I like them for some rehab applications. I probably wouldn't use them with a full class. Then you got weights. So you got weighted equipment. I've got weighted an ankle band that you can actually strap on, and it's weighted. Some people, I've actually seen them take this kind of thing into the pool. And I'm thinking, this is just a hand weight from a gym. I'm wondering what happens when I drop it. It's going to the pool floor. How are you getting it off the pool floor? Is it going to hit your foot? Who's getting it off the pool floor? Not a big fan for use in a pool setting. Talk to me about the kinds of equipment you either have at your facility or that you use on a regular basis or that you see other instructors using. Has it anything different than what I've pulled up tonight?
We use bender balls. We use noodles a lot. I use noodles a lot.
Okay.
And we have those smiley face things.
Right, the little discs.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so those are other options. Some people might use either a flutter board or this is a neck doodle, that gives you more options really, because you can put your hand through it and rest on it like that. I've seen it used that way for stroke rehab for some people. We use it in rehab quite a bit, but I've also seen people use them like they might use a flutter board. They're a little bit different density than a flutter board, but there's another option, another device This is a Brodinko water walker. This is something where you strap it to your foot, like you're wearing a snowshoe. As you lift your foot up, the flaps go down, so you have less surface area. As you push your foot down, the flaps open up, so you have more surface area. You could not use it in a pool where you have a liner because it would potentially cut your liner. It's not super sharp, but the weight of the person and whatever, you wouldn't want to wreck your liner. It is a little device that goes on to an arm or a leg, and you can see what it's designed to do. More surface area and turbulence, right? You're going to create more turbulence with that. It's pretty much buoyancy neutral, so it doesn't float things up, but it's going to create a lot more turbulent resistance. I showed you the one little cuff, and here's another one. I use these all the time, actually. It's a Speedo upper, and your hand goes through like that. And of course, it's creating more surface area and a ton of turbulence. The nice thing about it is it's not doing that to me. There's no buoyancy. It's buoyancy neutral, but they're expensive.
I was showing the equipment at one pool I went to, and she had a pole.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what do you do? What do you do with the pole? Like, she said, she showed me a pole.
Poles, it depends on the length of it and
Yeah,
whether
it was like, yeah, it was just a pole, and I said, well, I don't know what to do with that.
is it buoyancy neutral, or is it buoyant, or is it weighted?
I don't know. I just saw it, and I just thought I'd like. She said it was used for again Aqua Fitness, so I was
Okay.
wondering,
Yeah, so it may be
like, just to
you
play
you
with it.
can do things like,
Yeah, something like
rowing
that.
with it, kayaking. You can pass it under a limb, you can pass it around your body, you can push it down, pull it up overhead even. So it's creating and controlling some ranges of motion. Working with folks with stroke and having hemiplegia, they can use one arm to move the other. Or if you're rehabilitating, so it has some nice rehab applications to do that sort of thing.
I see a lot of video people using the noodle like under their legs, and like you can do a lot with the noodle, but it's
You can.
you need to be good at it because
And it's a lot of gripping, right? So that's something you have to consider. The thumb joint is really getting it. These are ones, so you can cut noodles up, as I said, and that's kind of if you want to do something, rather than buying the big expensive barbells that are usually too much for everybody. I mean, I have met very few people who need that much buoyant resistance. You can cut noodles up into little bits or even a disc. You can get as well these things, which are way more expensive, but they're a dense closed cell foam, and they have a hand strap. So instead of having to grab with my thumb like this, I can put my whole hand through it. So that takes a lot of the stress off the thumb joint, which I prefer. But this one, you can see these diameters are fairly similar. This one's much shorter. Again, it has a mechanism to grab. And I could also change out the noodle because this one has a Velcro strap. So I could put a different density of noodle into it, depending on the size and the shape. And when they're larger diameter, what's the workload difference? Do you know? Good luck, get it calculated, because I don't know. I know it's more, but it's pretty hard for people. It's not like the gym, where you can say, well, add 5 pounds. It's very different. There's so many variables that is very, very hard to kind of guesstimate for people. What they're going to feel. What does it feel like? So, because it's so hard to calculate exact workload, you can do that on land. In the water, you're much more going to be going for perceived exertion, telling you that you're overloaded, right? So you really need mental will to keep yourself going, to push that overload a little bit if that's your goal and you're healthy to do that. What's it feel like? Breathing hard, muscle fatigue. They may have a burning sensation in a muscle if they're working at a pretty high load. Shouldn't be pain. It shouldn't be pain. I really don't like hurting people. If it's hurting you while you're working with me in the water, what are you going to feel like when you get home? What are you going to feel like tomorrow? And unless you're the kind of person who's really driven by extremely high workloads, and some are, and they're not bad people. That's just them. Most of us can make gains with a lesser amount. We can work at it gradually and get ourselves stronger without hurting ourselves. And that's kind of the route I would like to take. Different kinds of gloves that you can see here in the margin of this slide, and there are different ones available. They're pretty cost effective. So I'm suggesting actually that if they can't overload enough, get some gloves. They're a great option. How not to use aquatic dumbbells. I think you were asking about this, Denise, right? Not under the armpits. Please never, never, ever in your life do that. You have so many nerves and blood vessels going through the axilla, through the armpit. And when that is up there, it's pressing on them. Look what it's doing to this little lady's shoulders. And thank you to Lynn Marr for the photograph. So this lady has her shoulders right up around her ears. And, you know, what is she accomplishing? It's cutting off the circulation and potentially pressing on nerves in her armpit. And you have no idea if she's a breast cancer survivor, in which case you're looking at issues related to lymphedema and pressing on scar tissue and radiation scars. So, you know, you just don't know that. Here's a lady in the orange suit here who's got some, oh my God, dumbbells. So in my estimation, unless she's way, way fitter than somebody might think she would be, I don't know how she's going to handle that without her hands really suffering and without her alignment around her shoulders and neck being compromised. Waving in the air. Why? They don't do anything in the air. It's like people waving noodles in the air. What's the purpose? What's the function? So I guess I'm a little too practical. I want to see a reason for wanting to do that. To do it as a stretch, okay, fine. But if that's part of your workout, I actually see people doing this, standing in chest deep water, doing dumbbell presses over their head. I don't get it. Please don't ever use them for flotation in deep water. Now, I will sometimes do a little routine in our pool where I'll have the dumbbells in my hand and I will be in chest deep water and I'll do some elevated activities with the dumbbells down by my sides and really trying to keep my shoulders down. So I'm using it as a way of working my scapular stabilizers, as well as elevating myself a little bit while I'm working. Okay, buoyant equipment, we've talked a little bit about that, done a bit on dumbbells. You are welcome to bring questions up later. Noodles, of course, are all different sizes, dimensions, densities, and the really heavy ones that facilities like to get because they don't break easily, they last a long time, they're very dense and they are harder. So when you're thinking about people's hands, they're harder to control. You can have them strapped to the limbs. I did show you those ones that have the little adaptation to allow you to hang on to it. I have seen people take a regular noodle like this and slice a hole through it, slice two holes that went through the center so you could stick your hand into the center of it, and then they use duct tape on both ends. So that's a totally homemade version of this. Things like neck doodle can be good for doing things like planks. But again, you have to look at neck alignment, wrist, hand, what's happening at the hands and the wrists. It might be okay for a short period of time, but you might not want to spend a long period of time doing that. Here's a cuff at the ankle. I went to a class in Calgary a number of years ago. Flotation cuffs at the ankle were what they used for deep water flotation. How many of you feel that stabilizing in deep water with either using a belt or a wave rider or riding a noodle like a horse is a little challenging for people? I find it is, right? Especially when they're new to it. After they get used to it, they get better at staying vertical and moving the way they want to. But if you're new to deep water and all your flotation's at your feet, when you have that buoyant device at your foot, does it know that your knee is a hinge that only moves in one direction? No, it doesn't. Does it care? Not at all. So it's going to try to go to the surface, and it can pull you sideways to the surface. It can pull you backward to the surface on any angle. That flotation device on the ankle, if that's the only thing you got holding you up in deep water, your knees are at risk. And depending on your hip issues, could be your hip, could be your low back, and it's going to be very challenging to do, I have to say. It's sort of like the kind of activity where people might go to deep water and put a foot on two different noodles. Have you done that? Even just playing? And you're trying to march or whatever with your foot on a noodle in deep water. It's like that kind of thing. And in fact, it's a little harder to control because it'll go off in any direction. So I was quite shocked when I saw a number of pools in Calgary, that was their deep water flotation. Things that are attached to the arms or held in your hands that are buoyant, one of the most difficult parts of that picture is scapular set. How many of you are describing scapular set to your participants just with regular teaching? Right? Rolling the shoulders up, back, down, and set them down low. So you're trying to get the shoulders away from the ears. They don't have to be pulled together in the middle of your back. You just want them nice and low on your rib cage, especially if you're going to put something in the hands that increases workload or that is buoyant. So what I find, and as my thumbs have gotten older, holding on to a noodle, a barbell, a dumbbell, whatever, my thumbs really don't thank me for that. So I have to start looking at adaptations. Even if I want to use a little guy like this, I'll start putting my thumb next to my index finger rather than gripping like this, rather than gripping around with the thumb. But that's hard to do on a barbell. I can do it, but it's a little trickier for me to control necessarily what I'm doing with the dumbbell. Okay, so this grip, which we all tend to use with an aquatic dumbbell, I find it can be very hard on the thumb because this thing's going to go off in any direction. You're moving it around, but it's not always giving you forces in a direction that's comfortable for your thumb joint. So I'm sensitive to how other people might experience that, or if they have carpal tunnel issues, other issues with their hands or thumbs particularly. Putting cuffs on ankles, calves, you're challenging the knee joint, and the knee is a hinge and it only wants to go in that one plane. And so those buoyant devices are going to take the knee in other planes. I find even in, I don't know if you folks have witnessed this, putting people into deep water, let's say, and having them do jacks. Have you had some of your people with knee issues come and talk to you after class and say, you know, my knee gets really achy when we do things like jacks? If this is my knee, you've got the lever down to the foot. That long lever is moving sideways on the knee. So the knee is getting lateral forces when I do jacks. So those people might be more comfortable doing kneeling jacks, depends on their knee issue. So it's an option I might offer them. Try a kneeling jack instead of a long-legged jack. I'll also suggest that they just go to the drugstore and get one of those little pull-on neoprene knee stockings, a little sleeve to put on their knee. And they're not that expensive. The chlorine will eat them eventually, but it will make their knee feel more stable. So that's a little tip I give to some people if they have ouchy knees. And this particular lady really loves doing deep water. That's her favorite. And she works very hard, but her knees weren't very happy. So we're also, as mentioned, we're increasing buoyant workload. And that is something that we'd have to test it in a lab. But the bigger it is, the bigger the buoyant workload. You're also increasing surface area. You're also increasing coefficient of drag. So it's something that absolutely would have to be calculated in a lab. And even if I got a number for it, I took it to the lab, they put it on a robotic arm, they moved it at a certain speed, a certain distance, and here's the number they came up with for the coefficient of drag of this one versus this one. Now, I put this in the hand of someone who is 6'2", and their arm is 5 inches longer than my arm. Another one is in the hand of somebody who has very short arms, but they have a lot of body fat. So their arm is quite buoyant. Those numbers have gone out the window. They're a guideline for us. They don't tell the whole story because it's being moved by a different individual with different body composition, different limb length. It's all very complex. So I come back to, you really have to look at perceived exertion. How are people feeling? Are they feeling comfortably fatigued? I like the word comfortable fatigue. I'm getting tired, but I'm not getting sore. I'm not in pain, but I feel like I had a good workout and my muscles feel tired when I'm done. So as mentioned, drag forces are increased with all of those devices. Buoyant equipment can be used for things like prone and lateral planks. Those are a nice little routine to do with people. Push the dumbbells down as this person is here, and then you can do unweighted jacks from that position. You can do unweighted jacks with hamstring curls. You can do hamstring jacks in this position, but you really have to think about how long am I holding that? Because while I'm holding it, I'm gripping. And so the grip is going to be tiring. When I grip, you heard the term white knuckle grip. When I grip something, my knuckles turn white because I have squeezed all the blood out of the area by gripping. And blood flow is what brings nutrients, takes away byproducts of metabolism. Blood flow is what keeps muscles feeling happy and nourished. So when I do this for a long period of time, I'm taking away blood flow to the muscles that are gripping. I will also affect the other stabilizing muscles around my shoulders and neck if I'm tensing up to do something that's quite hard for me. So here's some other buoyant equipment activities. Tying the noodle in a knot, as you see over on the right-hand side here. That's kind of a fun activity, and that's one of those things where you're treating it almost like a big beach ball. So I don't like passing it behind the back because for most people, depending on their range, try it yourself. and you'll start to feel what kinds of torque you get on your shoulder in that position. Push it around, let it float, reach around and get it, yes, but holding on to something that big and that buoyant behind your back isn't something I would ask anyone to do. Using the noodle on the ankle to do things like a buoyant hamstring curl. So when I do a hamstring curl with this, the hamstring part of the activity is being assisted by the noodle. The quad part of the activity, straightening my knee out, is being resisted by the noodle. So you really have to think of how the muscles are being activated. Over here, we've got a cuff, a buoyant cuff that's being used for stretching. So she's got a buoyant cuff on her ankle and is mobilizing her leg in an arc around her hip. And it's just a nice assist to the stretch of the hip and all the thigh muscles, as long as the knee isn't feeling uncomfortable. Balancing on noodles, doing heel up, heel lifts, and then lower the heel to the floor. That's kind of fun on a noodle. Although people have trouble getting the noodle down into that position and then getting it back up. Here's some resistive options. You've seen some of them already. My favorite by far are the gloves. And honestly, if I had a group that I was seeing regularly, I'm at a community class now, so they're drop-ins. I have a lot of regulars, but we have drop-ins all the time. But if I were teaching, as I did before at the Holiday Inn, where it was a fitness center and people were there for years, taught the same group for 20 years, I would encourage them to just buy their own gloves or give me your order. I'll order them for everybody who wants them and get them all in. One group that I know of, this was a group in Burlington that were very tight, very cohesive group. And what they did was they got, one of the ladies went to a craft shop and picked up the material and they made gloves. And you can sew the finger lines in if you want a little bit more stability within the glove, but you don't have to. It can be more just like a mitten and you fan your fingers out if you want to. So these are pretty simple to make if somebody wants to do that, or they're not expensive to order online. I've seen them for $20 a pair. And what do these guys cost? More than $20 a pair. I think they're pretty expensive, comparatively speaking. These green things that you see here, I think they're Hydrotone Bell. They have, like this Speedo one, they have a handle in the center, inside of that dome. It sort of reminds me of the hats of the old Crusaders, or whatever, the steel helmets that they used to wear with knights in shining armor. But they have a lot of holes in them, so they're creating a lot of turbulence. And they have an area to grip on the inside of the bell. They're buoyancy neutral. They're not going to sink. They're not going to push your arm up, but they will create a ton of turbulence and surface area. So they're increasing coefficient of drag with turbulence and surface area. These guys you're probably familiar with, the little wands. And again, you're gripping and you have the option of opening or closing the little louvers that are on there. Is it harder with it closed? Probably, but this creates a lot of turbulence as well. The idea is if I close this, I have a bigger surface area. If I open this, I have a smaller surface area, but this one might actually be more turbulent. So again, you'd have to go back to the lab to actually be sure about what you're saying if you made that suggestion. But that's something where we're increasing resistance through increasing surface area and turbulent effect. This little guy here, that's a Speedo gizmo. It's buoyant. So I know you were mentioning those little things, little face that you could put your hands in the holes, that kind of thing. So it's like this, but this is a bit longer. I think they're about a foot and a bit long. And that is buoyant, but you're also getting bigger surface area and you're also getting turbulent flow. So you're doing quite a bit to increase resistance because of those factors. Because it's buoyant, it's also going to tend to elevate the shoulders and potentially put torquing forces on the wrist. Not saying don't use it, just saying be aware of those things and maybe moderate how you might teach what you're teaching people, what kinds of moves you would do based on what that's doing to their hand, their wrist, their shoulder, their neck. Slow everything down. Get in the pool yourself and work with it and see what kinds of arm actions you find comfortable with it, what kinds of planes of motion work, what kinds of planes of motion seem to put more torque on your wrist, for example. You saw these little guys, the little yellow fins. They can go on a limb. I find they're quite small, but they're meant to go on your ankles or your wrists or a slender limb. However, they go in a certain direction. If I want to work in a different plane, if I've got them this way on my arm, then they're going to give me a lot of resistance in this plane, but they're not going to give me much resistance in this plane. So you might say, well, that's okay, because that'll give us a rest interval. But I'm only really going to be loading the plane where they're lined up to work against the direction of motion, right? So you may have to take them off, realign them. So I kind of like them for some rehab applications, but I don't know, in a class of 20 people, I'm not sure they would be as user-friendly, just from what my experience is with them. What I love about gloves is listed here. They're not as buoyant as dumbbells. Some gloves have a bit of buoyancy to them. These ones, for example, are a neoprene type glove, as opposed to these ones, which are made out of more of a swimsuit material. So these might be more durable, but these ones are also harder for me to get into a fist. Now you can say, well, that's a bit of work for your hand. Maybe that's not a bad thing, but it's harder for me to fist with these. With this, I could move my hand into various configurations quite comfortably, quite easily. So when you're considering gloves, those are some of the things you have to think about besides durability. Well, who are you working with and what's going to be the better fit for them? So the nice thing about gloves is I have multiple levels of resistance just by virtue of the fact that they're like my hand. So I can be doing, and this one actually has these ones are made by H2O Wear. I can either put my thumb into the slot, sock puppet time, or I can bring the thumb out if that's easier for me to grip something. I can do a slice in the direction of movement. I can do a fist in the direction of movement. I can do a flat fist. I can do a flat hand with the fingers together or a flat hand with the fingers apart. So that's a lot of bang for the buck. I've got myself all those levels of resistance. 2 people working side by each. One might be using long levers and a flat hand with the thumbs and with the fingers and thumbs spread out. And they're putting that big flat surface area against the water and they got the extra drag of the material. That's tough. That's hard work. So if they're going to go a big range with that big surface area, that's going to give them a lot of overload if that's what they need. And yet it's not pushing their shoulders up. It's not torquing any joints sideways because of buoyancy. The person beside them can be doing a much gentler option just by holding their hand in a different alignment. So that's what I like about it. I like that it's versatile. We all know that even though we call our class intermediate, but this might be an advanced whatever, we all know that we have a whole range of people's abilities and health histories and body composition and fitness levels and ages. The more versatile I can be with a piece of equipment, the happier I am. I can meet more needs and not hurt people, but give them the kind of overload that they would really came for, that they want. If people can't achieve overload in my class with all the options I'm throwing at them and they're moving well, then I always suggest gloves as the first option. Elastic options are here. They give you eccentric forces. So as we know, most of what you're doing in the water is concentric, meaning the muscle is getting shorter as it works against the resistance that the water provides. When I open the joint up, the muscles on the other side are working, and that's brilliant. That's a wonderful aspect of working out in the water. But I might want to do some eccentric loading, and elastic allows me to do that. So how many of you have worked with elastics in a land-based setting, or you're familiar with elastics, you use them a lot? Anybody use them in the water? A bit? You do, Anne?
Almost not at all, because they're so hard to clean up after the class.
And then they got to be dried.
Yeah.
And they also deteriorate, do you find, really quickly?
Very quickly.
Very
yes.
quickly.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm on the same page as you. I've used them for some rehab applications, but if you've got to wash them really well to get the pool water off them, you got to dry them, and still they don't last. They're breaking like that. Like they tend, maybe if you got some of the really heavy surgical tubing, and then gripping them, you're wrapping something around your hand if you don't have handles on it, and that's uncomfortable because in the water they'll slip out of your hands. So again, if you want eccentric forces, you can do that. By the way, buoyant equipment is going to give you eccentric forces as well because you're working differently. That's probably another whole workshop to go through what's different when you add buoyancy in terms of muscle activation, but it will change how my muscles work. And I will get some eccentric loading with buoyant equipment because the equipment's trying to go there and I'm trying to move it the other way, or I'm controlling how I'm getting it down or getting it up. So I can do some eccentric loading as well with buoyant equipment, but difficult to grip, cuts off circulation in the hands, and boy, they do not last well. You better have a budget for those. Weights, ankle weights are used quite often in Aqua stretch. So if you're familiar with that modality, we put them on people for various different kinds of movements we do with Aqua stretch. The handheld dumbbells, I don't get why people would take those into the water. I would prefer that people use those in a dry land environment. The other thing is if you've got anything metal, it will break down very badly, very quickly. It will rust. So even if you have those ankle weights that you see up there those are actually made for the water. They have ingots in them. This one I have here has actually, I think it has sand in it. Some of them have iron filings. You can only imagine the mess if one of them breaks in your pool system. How popular will you be if one of those lets go? Now, the ones that have ingots in them, and I think these ones that you see on top here have ingots. So those little iron bars, they have to be treated for the water. So they've got to have an anti-rust coating on them. And when that coating breaks down, they will rust. The other thing is with these ones are by Hydrofit, and they're quite nicely padded on the inside, but I have worked with some ankle weights that the padding doesn't protect your ankle bones. So they hurt when they're resting on your ankle bones, okay? So weights are problematic. I kind of don't see the application in a typical aqua fitness class. I would not use them personally. Maybe with a team application, if I had a team that was doing some very specific things that I thought weights would help. These are great for tractioning, by the way. If you want to traction a hip or a knee, put a weight on it and hang in deep water, and it's brilliant. But is that what you're going to do in an aqua fitness class? Probably not. So it depends on your application. Gripping forces on things like the hand weights are going to be really hard on the thumbs. And again, what happens if you drop it? It's on the bottom of the pool. Who's going to get it up if it's a fairly heavy weight? So I really think we're working in the water, to my mind. Let's use what's wonderful about the water and work with the water and use that medium in a way that is sensible and effective. And dragging things from land-based applications into the water sometimes just isn't really a good fit. Of course, go to the water and try things and see how things work for you, by all means. And send me an email or a video if you find something that you think would show a good application for some of these things. I'm always interested to learn. So here's some recommendations. I think that people should be able to do a really good, vigorous surface area factors, speed of motion, and nice big range of motion for a good 10 to 20 repetitions with great alignment without equipment. And then if they're not tired enough, then we'll talk about equipment. But how many people do you know who can't do that? And yet they want to pick up the barbells, right? They want to pick up the dumbbells. They want more load, but they're not moving well. They're not getting the kind of intensity they could if they could move better. So I'm a big fan of technique classes. Get people in a gym, talk to them for half an hour, 45 minutes. There's a slideshow I'll give you that you can talk to them about how to move well in the water. Then take them to the pool and do a technique class with them. Watch them from the front, from the side, turn off the music. Actually look at them and coach them so that they can actually feel what a big range of motion, good alignment, good torso stability looks like, what it feels like in their body. Develop their kinesthetic awareness. And if they're still not getting tired enough, then by all means, if they're doing all that and they're doing it well, then they are candidates for using something else. Add to it. And I would start with gloves. It's the least offensive. It's got lots of options built into it, and it's not very expensive. If people can't maintain scapular set, if they can't maintain core stability, like my darling husband there in that picture, he shouldn't have a barbell in his hand. If I saw somebody like that moving in the pool, I would really strongly encourage them to put the dumbbell on the pool wall and let's try moving a little differently first before you start adding that buoyant load. More recommendations. If you're going to add anything, so let's say they're already doing, you got them doing the best possible range, you got them doing, using their surface area options to increase or decrease intensity as they wish to. They can do it at faster speeds and maintain the range. Why don't we get you some gloves? Because you're saying that you're not tired enough anymore. You've gotten stronger, so you want more of a challenge. Well, let's get you some gloves. So the first thing I have to do, I got to do fewer reps. I got to slow things down for them. They have to back off on all the movement variables, like the speed of motion, perhaps even the range of motion. They have to take it a little bit gentler at first because they've got that added load. If you went to a gym and you were upping the weights, you're not going to do the same number of reps. You're going to start a little bit lower and you're going to work your way up and see how your body copes with that. So you have to, when you're thinking of your class design, you have to think, well, how long would I typically spend on these bi-tri curls? How long would I do that? How fast would I do that? So now they've got gloves on. Or now they've got something attached to their hand, or they're holding on to this, or they've got this. Let's just do fewer reps to start with. See how that goes. Maybe come back, do something different, come back and do another set of repetitions. So see how they're coping with it when you add something, and really be watching how people are moving and ask them how they're feeling, what their fatigue is like. Monitor exercise technique and tolerance with equipment before increasing repetitions, sets of repetitions, speed of motion, or range of motion. So they want to have good technique all the way along. That's where you're going to be the safest for the joints that are being stressed by the activity. It is overload. It's stressing the body. That's a given. We want that. We want to do it safely and appropriately for each person. More recommendations. Extremities and core have to stay stable and properly aligned when using equipment attached to the limbs. The fact is, if you're working with a group of people, you're going to have a range of abilities. And the hard part about these being in the equipment room, everybody figures they're ready for that. So, good luck on talking people down off that shelf and getting them to start to think a little differently about how they move, how they stabilize, and maybe considering something smaller, lighter, a little gentler. Instead of this, I would start with this, just because I want them to move well. I don't want them to have to be sore and have their neck hurting because of too much overload. Surface area factors, speed of motion, range of motion, intensity options without equipment will continue to be appropriate for those people who really aren't ready for the big guns. And honestly, I don't know many people who can move well with these. I've seen a lot of people exercising and doing it really badly. And they're doing it with something that's putting torque on some very small joints, as well as neck and shoulders. How many people have carpal tunnel? How many people have tennis elbow? Issues that they've been carrying with them for years. This is going to exacerbate those big time, even if you're doing what you can to try to get them to move well. Just that extra load and the fact that it's going off in any direction it wants to. It just wants to go to the surface. It doesn't care if it torques your wrist sideways to get there. I care. I don't want you to hurt yourself. I want you to work up to that kind of thing. And honestly, there aren't many people who are strong enough to do it. Useful equipment. So short noodle segments, cutting up noodle pieces, sometimes using half a noodle, a quarter, a half, 2/3, or even a full length. I know some of you are using full length. Full length are nice for things like planks. We can use them for flotation, ride them like a horse and get the feet off the floor and do some suspended activities. So those are all useful. Resistive gloves, small wands or small paddles. Go small. So instead of going big or going home, go small and start gently. Here's some other things in this picture here. And the sponges, your typical sponge that you would pick up at the dollar store, or some small barbells like that. The sponges are kind of neat because they give you more surface area. They give you a bigger coefficient of drag. They tend to be buoyancy neutral, right? Once they're wet, they just kind of stay there. You can also do some hand exercises with them. You can squeeze them out. You can do relays where you run, get your sponge loaded with water, run across the pool, fill up a bucket. I mean, you can build some fun and games into it if you've got a group that would like that. But they are also just something that's kind of nice to hang on to and fits to your hand. They don't tend to stress the thumb the same way. Small balls, small Aqua dumbbells, sponges or other, start little and build. You don't go into the weight room and pick up the 400-pounder your first day. Well, I don't. Maybe some of your folks would like to do that, but it wouldn't be my preference. In terms of core strengthening, There's a list, again, that's another whole workshop topic by itself, and we're nearly done. We don't want you to do repetitive tucks and hip flexion and crunches. We've got other ways to do that. So on the bottom, you see a picture of a single leg jack. So one leg is bent at the knee, the hip is open on both sides, one leg's long. That's great core training. You do vigorous jacks with one leg long and one leg short like that. That's working your core. Please, not noodles under the arms. Look at the neck alignment on the young lady at the top there. She's poking her chin forward, her shoulders are up, and the noodle is chafing under the arm. And back to breast cancer survivors, they should not be breaking the skin under the arm of the affected side. Functional vertical training, and there's a free course on the website, and the link for it is down here. So this free course, absolutely free, go onto the site. I don't spam people, I don't sell your email. So you can go ahead and take that on your own if you haven't yet. It's called the Back Whisperer. So that'll give you ideas. So in terms of an implementation plan in our last few minutes, I want you to think about the populations that you work with, that you instruct or train, what strengthening strategies are appropriate for them. And if you're thinking of adding equipment, where would you go with that? 3 ideas maybe that you've learned today, or 3 thoughts that have been triggered for you today that you could implement with your classes. So if you wouldn't mind unmuting yourselves, pop out any ideas. And this is also a time that if you have a question, you're welcome to pose that question as well. Put up your hand or unmute your mic and start speaking. As long as we don't have 5 at once, we'll be good. First of all, did you think about anything differently today as a result of what we've talked about? Okay, if so, Anne, you're shaking your head yes. What's something that maybe you're thinking about a little differently as a result of this discussion?
I don't think I've ever been really known how to set up a class so that everybody is working at their capacity. I mean, when we do noodles, everybody gets a noodle. When we do, and I know that there are people there who really cannot handle it or shouldn't have a noodle. And what I try and do is give them the small light noodles so that they're not under the same pressure as some of the other people. I just love how this is laid out, Connie. It's pretty clear. And
Thank you.
Yeah, it's given me a lot to think about.
Right. So if I had, let's say everybody was going to pick up a noodle, and I don't want people to feel badly, I could perhaps have some smaller segments cut. I used to, when I was using noodles regularly at my local community pool, I cut them in a whole bunch of different lengths. And so I said, color doesn't matter, but size counts. So you want to get 2 that are the same size. And I would have ones that were a foot long, maybe 14 inches long. I'd have some that were this long. And so people would come and get the size that they wanted to work with. And some people would say, no, thank you. I'd rather do my hand actions without noodles in my hands. So that's pretty simple. If you're working with full length noodles to do things, it kind of depends on what you're doing, but you could have some, if you're doing something like a front plank, a forward plank or a lateral plank. I find the lateral plank, a lot of people don't have the shoulder stability or strength.
They don't
Use a full size noodle and keep their shoulder down. They just simply don't. I will either I'll change what I'm teaching so that I'm not asking anybody in the group to do something that they wouldn't do well or safely. And I also have the option of maybe cutting up some 2/3 length noodles. If it's enough to hold them up, if they're buoyant enough, then, they'll be okay. So you can manipulate the equipment a little bit. And you can also make the equipment, make it really clear that it's a choice and really invite people to not use the equipment, right? I mean, it's part of how you set it up.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And that, for those who have maybe some discomfort in their hands or their shoulders, we're going to do it this way. And you can still get some intensity in there, but you're not going to have your thumb bothered by holding on to something, right? So pointing out what the benefits are for them.
I do have do a strength and conditioning class where I have one gentleman who never breaks into not a visible sweat. He's not breathing hard. I don't know what to do for him when the rest of the class is
dying,
quite limited in what they can do.
And is he working well? Is his technique good?
It's fair to middling. We're working on it.
So one of the first things you could do is give him more range. get them to do bigger range with everything,
Hmm.
and then increase the speed with that range.
Yes, that was very clear. in
If
the
he's
presentation.
coachable,
Yeah.
if he's coachable, you know,
Yes.
some are, some aren't. Some can't
Mhm.
hear it, see it, feel it. Denise, you had your hand up?
Oh yeah, I'm not in the rush. I just started to teach at this facility, and I know these ladies, they come 5 days a week, and they come all the time. And I know the other instructors, they are using equipment because they're not AQX like trained. So anyway, but the first thing I said was, I am not using equipment, you know, like at the beginning, and they know, and they don't ask for it.
Yay.
But last time there was a lady that said, I'm using the weights. And then she took it and she used it alone.